Yes? Okay. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Thursday, April 9th, our next Chatting with NDGS Paleo talk, and all my stuff is falling over here. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Nicholas Famoso. Nick got his undergraduate degree down at the nearby South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, so he spent time in our area before. I first met Nick when he was working with me at Badlands National Park down in South Dakota. And apparently Nick enjoyed working at Badlands National Park so much that he continued on, and he is now Chief of Paleontology at John Day Fossil Beds National Monument out in Oregon. And I should note that he got both his master's and PhD from the University of Oregon as well. So Nick is here today to talk to us about horses. There's a lot of interesting things about horse evolution that is specific to North America, and actually to this region that includes North Dakota over here as well, where a lot of early horse evolution takes place. So as a little intro here is a subset of my daughter's toy horse collection. Here, I note this is a subset, this is not her full collection, but she was very insistent that I show everyone her little horses. So these are modern horses, the morphology wise. So you'll notice these are accurate anatomical models, by the way. So you'll notice the one big large toe or hoof on each foot. And I'm sure that Nick will have some reference to how we get to that point as well in his talk. But you'll notice that's a very key feature for horses. They have one large toe. Why do they have just one large toe? How did they get to one large toe? Well, let's find out by sitting back and listening to Nick tell us all about horse evolution. So thanks for being here today with us, Nick, and take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you, Clint. I appreciate it. All right, let me get myself presenting my screen here. Okay. So, as Clint mentioned, I am Nick Famoso, Chief of Paleontology here out at John Day Fossil Beds in Eastern Oregon, Eastern and Central Oregon. So we'll start off first with where exactly I am, because I'm sure a lot of you aren't quite familiar with where Oregon is or where my particular part of Oregon is. So this is our lovely map of the United States, and Oregon is the black section over there. And I'm off in the eastern and central part of the state. So this is kind of the extent of Oregon, right? A lot of people know Portland, which is over here. This is the Willamette Valley. So most of the people in the state live over here. When you think of Oregon, you usually think of this part of Oregon. I'm on the other side of the Cascade Mountains, so it's very different over here. It's very dry and sagebrushy steppes. And what I've got showing over here are the distributions of the different rock layers that we have in my park. So there are 3 units of the park, and I'll get into a little bit of that later. And those are the black dots here. But that's what the monument itself protects. But the geologic rock layers that have all the fossils that I care about actually extend to a much wider area outside of the state. I mean, this is almost a third of the state of Oregon. And just thinking about distances, drive time wise, to get from where I am actually over here by Sheeprock to Portland is about a 4.5-hour drive. So I mean, we've got a lot of distance to cover here to get anywhere. Crater Lake, if you're familiar with that, is down here, and that's about 6-ish hours from where I am. So I mean, we're a pretty big state. We've got a lot of land to cover. So this area is actually quite significant, quite large. And we work with lots of other people to, you know, protect the fossils and figure things out about those, about what's going on in our period of time. And especially right now with everything going on, it might be difficult for you to physically come and visit my lovely park. However, we do offer virtual options. You can even get a passport stamp virtually. You can print that off of our Facebook and Twitter feeds and print that out and put it in your book like you would if you could physically come here. So where the park is, more specifically, what we've got going on. So when we zoom in a bit more to where the park is, you got the Sheeprock unit, which is this lovely place over here. And that's where our visitor center is, and some nice little hiking trails. And you've got 2 other units, Painted Hills. You may have actually seen photos of Painted Hills before. This is the beautiful like red and yellows that's a really pretty place to go. And then the Clarno unit, which is a couple of hours north of where I am in the Sheeprock unit. Now, the one thing to keep in mind too is that right now the park is completely closed, so this is extra reason to not come now, but in the future, if you're ever in lovely Eastern Oregon or Central Oregon, feel free to come on by once we're open again. So how long has paleontology been going on in the region? Pretty long time. You know, Western science has been working in this area since the 1860s, starting with Thomas Condon, who was a reverend up in the Dalles, which is up in the Columbia River Gorge. And he always had a real passion for science and paleontology. And the soldiers that were protecting the military road that were down in my area kept finding these fossils and said, hey, this guy, he'll think these are cool. We should bring them up to him. So they brought him up to him, and he got really excited, came down here in the 1860s. And yeah, then that's when things just started going crazy. He started telling the famed Cope and Marsh, if you're familiar with the Bone Wars, started telling them about his finds out here in Oregon. And he even shared some of those fossils with him, with Marsh, and I'll explain a little bit of that later. But it started a big chain reaction, which led to work being occurring out here in the 30s and 50s, and still to this day. So it's still a very active area of paleontology research. So speaking of Cope, Marsh. So speaking of O.C. Marsh, he at this time I think was at Yale University, and he would receive fossils from Thomas Condon, and particularly the fossil horses were very interesting to him. And he used a lot of those fossil horses in kind of filling in the gaps in horse evolution when he was writing to Darwin, for example. He was telling Darwin about all these cool horses in North America, and it included fossil horses from Oregon. So Joda or John Day fossil beds. If I say Joda, it's John Day fossil beds. The fossils from out here kind of helped to fill in a lot of those gaps. And unfortunately, Condon sent these fossils to Marsh under the impression that he would send them back to Oregon. And he never did. The only thing that Condon ever got back was this lovely pocket compass over here with an inscription that to the Reverend Thomas Condon from O.C. Marsh. Which this is actually still on display, I should say, at the University of Oregon, because after Condon did his time as a minister, he became the first state geologist and also became the first professor of natural history at the University of Oregon, where he ended his career, and his collections of fossils from all over the world still are there in Eugene today, which is pretty cool. So yeah. And the John Day Basin, a little bit more, getting into the science of the area. So we cover about 40 million years of time. So this time column, this is a column of geology over here on the right. The oldest stuff is on the bottom, youngest stuff is on the top. And this is just kind of to show you that we have a lot of stuff here. And those 3 units that we were talking about, they cover a lot of that period of time. The numbers that you're seeing up along the side of the column, those are dates. So we actually have a lot of page numbers to figure out how old all the things are. And this is all in one place, as you saw, so we can actually get a good sense of how plants, animals, and climate change through time, which is actually really wonderful for looking at fossil horses. Yay! The whole point of today's talk, right? So our fossil horses are really well described here. So a lot of the examples I'm going to be showing you today are from Oregon. But I will make sure that I tie it back to the plains. That's where I did a lot of my work when I was starting out. As Clint said, I was in South Dakota, and I spent a while in Nebraska too. So I want to make sure I'm tying back in to that part of the world too, because that's really, really important for the evolution of these pretty cool animals. So horse evolution, right? A lot of people think that horse evolution is a step-by-step, right? I mean, one horse, then you go to the next horse, then you go to the next horse. Really, that's the easiest way to show it to most people. But in actuality, it's more like this. This is a bush, right? It's kind of bushy and branchy. So this is kind of looking at time going from left to right, with the oldest on the left and the youngest on the right. So we're sitting over here where my little red dot is. And what you can see is, like, it's not just a one step to the next, right? There is one line where you can kind of like get to modern horses, but there's a lot of dead ends. There's a lot of, you know, if you could say, experimentation with different body plans, different sizes, different diets, different feet, different lots of things. And that's how life evolves, right? It's really complicated, and it changes, and does lots of different things. So we'll be looking at more specifics throughout this timeline. Now, what exactly changes? Well, for horses, you go from our lovely little early horse, like the dude over here on the right, and then you get to what we know of today. So how do you go from this to this? Well, there is about 40, 50 million years of time in there for evolution to have taken place. But the world is changing around them. They go from a warm and wet environment 50, 40 million years ago to a much drier and cooler environment that we see today. We go from that tropical, subtropical environment out, in North America, clear up north, even up, further north than North Dakota, right? And now it's cold a lot. It's very different from what it was back then. But you see changes in the feet, you see changes in the teeth, the positions of the eyes, how the back moves, even the size. We suspect that there's differences in social groups, and you see a lot of adaptations to running start to evolve over time rather than hiding around in bushes. So we'll start going into the line of how that all, of some examples of these animals. So the first one I'm going to show you here is from the Paleocene. This is the oldest rocks from the age of mammals. So we're looking at 66 to 56 million years ago. So anytime you see MYA up on the top, that is millions of years ago. And this is a lovely sculpture by a colleague of mine of Eohippus, one of the earliest true horses that we know of. And this animal is about the size of a small dog. So we're talking like, 30 pounds kind of animal. And some of the things that you'll see that are different, the hands, the front feet here, they have 4 toes, and the back feet have 3, right? Most horses today, as well, I should say most, unless they have a little mutation, they only have 1 toe on the front and the back, right? So the other thing you'll notice is that these are kind of spread out feet. So one thing to keep in mind is that these animals are living in like fairly wet tropical environments. And so an idea is that wider feet were better adapted to walk around on kind of wet mud without sinking in. Because you can imagine if you have like a 1-toed horse now and you try to step them in mud. I mean, I've had that with my own horses. They just sink in the mud, and it's not very easy to get, they don't like that. But their ancestors from long time ago probably didn't have that problem, right? And the other thing you'll notice is the way that we have painted this particular individual. So we try to use examples of coat patterns that are similar to what we see in forest-dwelling animals today. So like deer and some other animals like down in Asia, in the tropical areas of Asia too. Because that's what we suspect these animals were doing, hiding out in forested areas and in bushy areas like that. So that's why we kind of paint them to look like that, is because that's what we think they were doing. The other things you'll notice too is like the face isn't all that long. The eyes are kind of further forward. They don't have a super long snout. But one of the things you'll notice, or that I'll show you now, is these teeth. And if you do this Hyracotherium, if you're wondering about that, Hyracotherium, there's a lot of confusion whether or not Hyracotherium and Eohippus are the same thing or not, but they're very similar in a lot of ways. But you can see their teeth here. And the point is that, like, this is a molar, so this is like the back molar. So if you take your tongue and you reach up to the top of your mouth into one of the 2 corners, that's the same tooth. And in a lot of ways, these teeth look a lot like our teeth. They're very low crown. They're only maybe like, half an inch, quarter inch tall, and they're not very wide at all. They're very small. A term for this is unodont, which kind of just means it's like blunt. So they got these short, blunt teeth. And they're probably eating bushes and leaves and things. So that's the earliest horses, true horses. This is basically what they look like. And where exactly were they? So we see them kind of show up at the same time in North America and in Europe and Asia. So it's kind of hard to tell whether or not they are from Europe, Asia first or North America first. Kind of depends on who you talk to. They basically show up simultaneously though. So I generally say that they show up at both places at the same time. But almost all the evolution of horses happens in North America. So that is why we usually tell the story of horses in North America. So if we go a little bit further in time to the Eocene, which is the first rock layers that we have in John Day fossil beds, you can kind of see what the environment would look like. Very tropical, subtropical. You've got avocados, you've got bananas. There's even alligators. There's alligators in Oregon. There's alligators even in North and South Dakota at this time, right? So very different environment, very wet, very kind of tropical world out there. There's palms everywhere. It looks more like Louisiana than it does like this area today. And there is a horse. It's in this mural. It's called Orohippus. He's hiding right there. Zoom in on him a little bit. And as you can see, right, he's painted they're kind of painted like a deer, hiding in the bushes. And this is the lower jaw of that animal. And, that jaw is maybe like 2 or 3 inches long. So it's not a very big animal. These are very low, blunt teeth, right? So that's one of the things with these guys too. They look a lot like their predecessors, Eohippus, a little bit more complicated teeth. And the feet basically look the same. Eyes are basically in the same position, right? We move a little bit further in time. Here's a few more horses that we have here. They're hiding right there. We paint them to look a little bit more like horses, but they have a lot of differences too from what we see in modern horses. But basically the same kind of thing. You have Epihippus and Haplohippus here, 3-toed horses, still kind of short snouts. They're still primarily feeding on bushes, tree leaves, the equisetum, which is horsetail, they're feeding on those two probably. And they're not as abrasive foods. They're not as hard foods to eat. So they don't need very tall teeth like modern horses have. And we move a little bit forward in time. This is the Oligocene, 34 to 23 million years ago. And one of the things you'll notice in this particular mural is that it looks a lot more temperate in this environment. You have hardwood trees, you have changing colors, you have seasons. This is pretty standard across North America at this time. You see a lot more of these forests start to show up. And that's a big change from that semi-tropical environment that we had just a few million years before this. And there are some horses hiding here. They're right there. They're really hard to see. They're kind of camouflaged. But we zoom in a bit, and this is a critter called Mesohippus. And this is a horse that you also have in South Dakota, North Dakota, all throughout the Great Plains, actually. It's a very common horse to find. And their teeth are very different. I mean, you remember those other ones from earlier, they just had little like bumps in these areas. But now there's like all these little loop-de-loops all over the place, and their teeth are a little bit taller. They're bigger animals. I mean, this is more like a large dog-sized animal rather than a small dog. But they do get a little bit bigger, and that's the next guy here. This is another mural from out here in Oregon. This is the most common horse that we find in most of the John Day fossil beds area, and that's this critter right here, and that is Miohippus, the bigger cousin of Mesohippus. And this horse, this is a little bit easier to see him. So he still has 3 toes. The face is a little bit longer. When we look at the skull over here, you can see those teeth are still pretty low crowned. They're still a little bit, they're taller than like human teeth are. The eye is still pretty far forward, so making the face kind of short still, right? And they're still kind of hanging out in trees and things. They're eating on bushes and tree limbs or tree leaves and whatnot. And you get a little bit more diversity at this time. There's this other critter, Calabatypus, which still looks a lot like all the other horses. but they're starting to get a little bit more advanced. They still have 3 toes, but they're starting to not maybe have so much use of those 3 toes. So now we're going to get into the Miocene, which is 23 to 5 million years ago. It's a huge swath of time. And if you remember back to our lovely graph here, our lovely tree, you'll notice, like, you know, everything was pretty thin up until you get to this blue line. Well, what is at the blue line? But the Miocene, right? So the Miocene is sometimes called the heyday of horses, right? They are really, really starting to expand at this time. There's a lot more diversity in horses. And a lot of people think that this has to do a lot with the spread of grasslands. And horses seem to do really well in grasslands as they adapt to fit those roles. There's probably more roles to fill, and no one else was doing it at the time, and they were really good at filling those roles, and so they were able to diversify pretty quickly. So during this time, we mostly see horses in North America during the Miocene. But this is the period of time when you start to see them migrate into Europe and Asia. As I said before, most of the evolution happens in North America, and then they move over into Europe and Asia. So you see a lot of the same kinds of horses that show up during this period of time over in Asia that you see in North America, but we definitely have the earliest of those groups over here, and then they move over there and diversify. And in fact, by the end of this period of time, they're even down into Africa. So what exactly did it look like at this time? Well, it's still kind of foresty, but one of the things you might notice is that there's a lot more open space starting to show up in this mural. So this period of time, there's a little entelodont there, one of the Terminator pigs hanging out, which if you're familiar with the Badlands of South Dakota, they're really common out there too. But that's why these little horses here, the parahippus, are starting to run away, is because there's this big mean old pig sitting over there scaring them off. But these horses still are kind of, you know, they're starting to get the adaptations that you see for grasses. Grasses are starting to spread at this time. And one of the things to say about grasses is, if you've ever tried to eat grass, it's very close to the ground, right? And when you try to get stuff out of the ground that close to the ground, it gets a lot of dust and dirt on it. And that dirt has silica in it, and silica is sand, basically. And when you try to eat, if you ever try to eat sand or sandpaper, it wears down your teeth very quickly. And it's not very comfortable. And if you're going to do that for a living throughout your whole life, it would be good if you had taller teeth. So one of the adaptations that you see is these horses start to develop taller and taller teeth as they're spending more time eating these hard material on the grasses. And grass itself also has some hard little balls of sand, basically silica, inside of the blades of grass too, that make it a little bit tougher to eat than leaves off a tree or off of a bush. So this is a little bit further in time, and I love this mural because we're starting to see a wider diversity of animals, of horses particularly. So there are 3 groups of horses hiding out in this mural here. Some of them look like the ones we've already seen. Some of them are a little bit more advanced. So some examples here. The first, the little gray horse here, this is Archaeohippus. It's actually kind of a dwarf horse, smaller than all of its cousins, but its teeth look a lot more like the Miohippus teeth that we were seeing before, or Mesohippus too. They're a little bit more that shape, so they were still eating what we call browse, which is those leaves and twigs and things. And then you have Parahippus again, that one we were talking about before, that's starting to get like excited about having taller teeth because it's eating more grass. I mean, it's not really getting excited, but you know, I'm sure as a species or as a genus, it was pretty excited about it. You know, if it had, you know, a mind in that way, which we know they didn't. And then you also get this other group. This is Acritohippus. Used to be called, this particular kind of Acritohippus used to be called Merychippus. And people might be more familiar with that name, but one of the things I want to show you is the skull, right? So you kind of remember that that Miohippus skull, the eye was a lot further forward actually over the teeth. That isn't, and this is the eye over here, not this. This is a hole for a gland, but this is the eye over here, right? So it used to be sitting basically where this gland is in the myohippus, but it's very far back now. And why is it far back? Well, it's probably because its teeth are a lot taller now. So the teeth are actually clear up here. The roots of the teeth are clear up here. Whereas with that myohippus, they were down here. So the eye starts to move backwards as you get taller and taller teeth, which makes sense because honestly, I wouldn't want to have my teeth in my eye either. It doesn't work particularly well. It's very uncomfortable. And the other things, they still have 3 toes. They're still kind of living in this environment in the trees. And so we say that they are mixed feeders in that they're eating both the kind of leafy browse off of the trees and bushes, but also starting to explore eating grasses a little bit. There's also a really big horse at this time called Hypohippus. And that horse was eating only leaves. And this is an example of its teeth. They look a lot more like those myohippus teeth. But this is a fairly interesting thing, is that we still have horses eating only browse at this period of time. And this horse is pretty big. I mean, this is the skull of this animal is about the same size as kind of a small modern horse. So they're pretty much the same size as modern horses, but they've got 3 toes and their teeth look dramatically different, right? So these critters don't really last too much longer. They basically are in this period of time in the Miocene, and then they go away. And then by the end of the Miocene, everything starts to look a lot more like we see today. So this is Eastern Oregon today, which, you know, looks a lot like North Dakota, South Dakota area, with the exception of all the big exploding volcanoes. This area, you know, this is what horses really evolved to live in, right? This kind of environment, big open plains, out with large, vast expanses of places to travel and find food. And our horses are hanging out right there in the foreground. And if we look at the one on the right, they look a lot more like horses we expect, right? There's 1 toe. Their eyes are further back. Their face is longer, right? And you also have this other group of horses that are a little smaller, and they still have 3 toes. So if you look kind of close here, there is a little bump sticking off the side of this horse's foot, and that's one of the 3rd toes. But one of the things that you see differently during this period of time is that some horses have 3 toes, some do not. In fact, members of the same species and the same population, if you go to ashfall fossil beds in Nebraska, you'll see individuals of the same herd that have of a relative of this kind of horse that have 3 toes and some that have 1 toe. So it's transitioning at that point, because those side toes aren't particularly useful anymore. They've reduced them to basically not being a functional toe anymore, and they're doing everything with that main toe, which is what this other horse, Neohipparion, was doing. The other thing that's kind of different, because I haven't really showed you much about teeth loop-de-loops in a while, is that the teeth are actually kind of different. So you'll notice, like, this one has less loop-de-loops, and this is similar to Dinohippus over here, and the Neohipparion over here has more, you know, complicated loop-de-loops. And this may be, this is just like a factor that's involved with both of these animals on what they do with the surfaces of their teeth. But the other thing we'll notice is that I haven't said this word before, but remember I was talking about the teeth being really tall and moving the eye back. Well, the tall teeth are what's called hypsodont teeth. So this is hypsodonty, which is taller teeth. I saw someone asked a question about that earlier. So this is kind of the story of that, is just the taller that the teeth get, right? And at this time, these 2 groups have fairly similarly tall teeth, but this one tends to have taller teeth than the group on the left. And then we get into basically what a lot of people think of as like the Ice Age. You know, you go from the Pliocene, which is about 5 million years ago, when things start to get a lot cooler, and to about 10,000, 11,000 years ago. So in that earlier part, if you've ever been out to Idaho, there's this place called Hagerman Fossil Beds. Hagerman has a zebra relative, at least it has a lot of similarities to zebras. So that horse is basically like a modern horse. If you look down at the feet again, of this reconstruction, you'll see that it's one toe. It basically looks like a horse. And yeah, I mean, they basically all look like this at this point, right? From this point on, they all kind of look like horses going back to about 5 million years ago. When you get into the Ice Age, horses still look like horses, right? But they're shaggier because it's colder. So they're a lot fuzzier, and some of them get a lot bigger. So that's a big thing that you see with animals during the Ice Ages, mammals particularly, is that they get bigger and they get fuzzier. And that's probably, all of those things together are probably really great adaptations for living in those cold environments. So in fact, during the kind of colder Ice Age periods during this period of time, there is one particular horse that's 25% larger than a Clydesdale. If you're familiar with a Clydesdale, that's one of the largest horses that lives today, the draft horses that used to pull carts and whatnot. Those aren't the biggest horses that ever lived. There were bigger ones than that. So yeah, so we have these Ice Age horses. And then, how do we get to the horses that we have today? Because at some point, horses aren't native to North America anymore. But, another thing I almost forgot is, we've been talking a lot about North America, and we've been talking a lot about Europe and Asia and Africa, but we haven't talked at all about South America. Were there ever horses in South America? In fact, there were. And that's this cool thing called Hippidian. So it goes down into North America, about 2 million years ago during this thing called the Great Biotic Interchange. And North America gets a lot of cool things from South America, some of which are still alive today, like armadillos. And what was the other thing that was pretty cool that comes from there? Sloths came up here. So we find fossil sloths. Parrots came up here at that time. There's some other cool animals that I'm forgetting too. Oh, possums. How could I forget our friends, the possums, right? So possums came up here at this point as well. But South America also got a lot of things in the exchange, including elephants and saber-toothed cats and camels, think llamas and alpacas, but they also got a horse. And one of the horses that comes down there is this thing called Hippidian. And Hippidian is kind of cool because its skull looks really weird. What's going on up here, right? These are where the nose bones are. Like, that's pretty bizarre. What's going on there? Well, when we reconstruct that and look at animals that we see today that have nose bones that look like this, they either have really muscular lips or they have trunks. And so we think that this horse that lived in South America actually had a little bit of a muscular lip, more like what you see in rhinos that eat leaves and twigs rather than grasses. But if you're familiar with horses, you might say, but horses already have really muscular lips. They do a lot of really awesome stuff with those lips, grabbing grasses and things. It's like, yes, but this one was even more so, right? So I'm sure you could probably shake hands with this horse's trunk, if you will, right? That's how muscular it was, which is pretty cool. So now we've talked about a South American horse, which does go extinct about 10,000 years ago. So about 10,000 years ago, all the horses in North America are gone, and you only see the ones in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And they stay there for a long time until about 1500 AD, when the Spanish bring horses back over into North America, and that is the wild horses that we see today. And I will preface that, or it's not prefacing it, I will add that what I'm telling you now is based on fossil data, fossil information that we currently have. We don't have any fossil horses from between 10,000 years ago and 1500 that we are confident that in saying that they are from that period of time. So that is why science says that we didn't have horses from that period of time. Now, if we find new data, that would be great. That would help fill in a gap, and maybe horses didn't go extinct in North America at that time. But given the current data that we have, that is what science tells us. But as all good scientists, we're willing to change given new data. So then we get to modern horses, right? We all know modern horses, or most of us know modern horses. You get domesticated horses like our friends up here in the upper left. These are two of my horses, and they're just kind of hanging out in the pasture. We also ride horses, right? A lot of people do that. And there's a lot more sizes and shapes of horses that people have kind of forced horses in those directions to look like that. And then you also have some of well, you have this guy over here, which isn't a truly wild horse, but it is a feral horse from Asia. And then you have our friends, the donkeys and the zebras, right? So those are the horses that we have today. And they kind of look different from looking at them, but their teeth are also different. I studied fossil horse teeth, so if you're wondering, that's why there's lots of horse teeth in all of these presentations. And we can't actually tell the difference between zebras, horses, and donkeys. And the main thing to look at is that these are the lower teeth. They look a little different. There's little different squigglies, and these squigglies are consistent throughout all zebras, domesticated horses, and donkeys. So that is one way that we know that that Hagerman horse I talked about a while back is a zebra, because they have this little structure here. It is consistent for all zebras. So just to kind of summarize again, what changed? The feet are a big thing, right? Going from all these multiple toes for being better for living in wetter environments to living in drier and drier environments where the ground is harder, and also you need to run a lot faster. So eventually you get down to just one toe. And the other thing that changes a lot are the teeth, right? Our Eohippus-like horse has teeth almost like ours. And then you get to the browsing horses, and then you get to our lovely grazing horses with their teeth so tall in their face. I bet a lot of people didn't know that their teeth were this tall. But they, these are those great adaptations for living in open habitats, eating grasses, running away from predators, protecting yourself in groups. Those are a lot of the big changes that you see. And with that, I can take questions.
How common is it for you to find a horse fossil in the park?
That's a good question. So horse fossils aren't the most common fossil that we find, but I would say we probably find a horse fossil, let's say if we go out for the equivalent of 2 weeks of 8-hour days, we probably find at least maybe 5-10 fossils of horses in that period of time. So I mean, it's not super common. Most of the time we find the little mouse deer, or these things called oreodonts. But so they're not the most common thing that we find, but we do find them pretty regularly.
So different studies have different names. For instance, the study of insects is the entomology, or the study of fish is the ichthyology. Does the study of horses have a name?
So there isn't a particular name just for the study of horses. In general, I would just kind of stick to the study of mammals, which is mammalogy. And if you're doing it kind of in the what I call deeper time, in the fourth dimension, as my advisor would call it, you could call it paleomammalogy or paleobiology. But yeah, there's not a specific term just for people who study horses.
Do any horses have fangs, like some of the fanged deer?
So they have those teeth, they have canines, but they don't have like really big ones. Even the early horses don't really seem to have canine teeth that get that big.
Are horses related to deer, or the other way around?
In a very roundabout, long distance way, they are. They share a common ancestor that goes back. I'm trying to think about how far back that goes. I mean, it is pretty far back in time, but they are kind of closely related. So deer are even-toed ungulates. So they're even-toed hoofed animals, and horses are odd-toed hoofed animals. And they are fairly closely related as like a group of, like as those two groups can be, but that diverged, they separated a very long time ago, but they're more closely related to each other than to a lot of other animals. So like they're more closely related than they are to carnivores, like a cougar, or elephants. Even elephants are even more distantly related. Kind of deal. But rhinos are really closely related to horses. Rhinos and horses and this thing called a tapir are probably the three the two most closely related living things to horses are tapirs and rhinos, which look very different.
How did ponies come to be?
People. So people wanted ponies, like we think that we ride on today. We wanted them to be a particular way. So this is in biology what we call artificial selection. So that's when people kind of select, like, you know, you get a girl horse and a boy horse, and you like the characteristics of both of them, and you want to have a baby horse that shares those characteristics, so you stick them together and you make a horse that has those characteristics. Other animals that are kind of like that are dogs and chickens. There's a lot of, like, we want it to look this way, so we breed them together to try and produce an animal that looks that way. So that's eventually what happened with ponies, particularly the small ones. I had a small pony when I was a kid, and he was kind of a gruff little guy, but we wouldn't have had him if people hadn't been kind of selecting for smaller horses to do a particular job.
What is the earliest time frame that we know of where humans were using horses?
Using horses, that is a hard question. Living together with horses, there's actually a really cool example in Oregon from about 14,000 years ago in North America. So we know they were living together, but as far as using horses, I'm not exactly sure exactly when that first starts to show up, but it's definitely kind of more in that after the Ice Age ends 10,000 years ago. It's somewhere in that range. I don't know that date offhand specifically, but I do know that it is you know, more than 5,000 years ago and less than 10,000. So it's somewhere in that range for sure.
What is your favorite prehistoric horse species?
Ooh. I mean, that's like asking you who your favorite kid is, right? I mean, you love them all. But I think that Hippidian is pretty cool because it has a trunk. But I think my favorite is probably Pliohippus, which is the horse I was alluding to earlier, where you see some individuals in a population that have one toe and other individuals that have three toes, just because it gets very clear that, you know, they're starting to transition and they're mutating in a way where they don't need those side toes anymore. So I think that one is probably my coolest one, is my favorite one. I think is the coolest.
We have a couple questions about zebras, one
Okay.
of which is what makes a zebra, not a horse, or is it a horse? And the second half of that is, have any zebras been tamed?
So what makes a zebra different? So one of the things I was mentioning earlier in the teeth, so there is like some differences in the teeth that suggest that zebras are a different thing than other horses and donkeys. And there's some skeletal differences in them, but one of the things I'll say is that even though zebras, horses, and donkeys are different species, they're all fairly closely related to one another, in that you can actually produce offspring when you have them breed, which there's combination like zebras and horses, there's combination donkeys and horses. So I mean, they're close enough that they could still like make a baby horse or a horse-like thing, but they are different enough, mostly in that they live in a different area and they have adaptations more specific to living in the environment that they live in. So like a cool example too is I've heard that one of the explanations for the stripes on zebras is to confuse biting flies, right? So that's an adaptation that you don't see in other horses, maybe because they didn't live in an environment where biting flies were as much of an issue as they are in Africa. So they just have been under different evolutionary pressures to evolve to look like zebras you have today, which ends up with a couple of skeletal, tooth, and coat pattern differences.
This is actually a perfect question or a perfect follow-up question. We have the breeding between the horses and the donkeys to produce a mule. Why can't mules have offspring?
So that's interesting because I'd say 90%, I'm just throwing out a ballpark number. I don't actually know the number here, but it's like 95% of mules can't produce a baby. There is like a rare one that can, but then almost always that offspring can't do anything, right? So there are some exceptions, just like everything in biology, there's always an exception. But it has to do a little bit with the specific genetics. So, and it basically, like, the animal just doesn't have all the right genes to produce a offspring that can make more babies. And I don't know all the very nitty-gritty specifics. You probably want to talk to a geneticist about that, or someone that works on modern horses a lot more frequently than I do and not just looks at their bones. But there has a lot to do with the genes, and and like I was saying before, like, they are close enough that they can produce a baby, but it doesn't always mean, right, that the genes produce an individual that is like a fully functioning normal thing. And that's why we don't have wild species of mules, right? And that is a thing that people make to have happen. And it's probably just because those two groups have been evolving independently where they're from for long enough that they've mutated enough where their genes just aren't quite as compatible as they would have been a few million years ago.
All right, we have a question from Tony the Terrific and Tremendous here. Are zebras black with white stripes or white with black stripes?
Oh man, that is that's a great question. And I'm not sure what the answer would be to that. I would think, using what I know, is that it's probably black with white stripes would be my guess. But I don't know that for sure, only because I know that, well, black isn't really black. It's really, really, really dark brown, and that's a lot more common color than white tends to be. But that's just me, and I don't know that for sure.
I'm going to chime in here.
Okay.
They're actually white with black stripes.
Okay.
And you can tell if you look at their bellies, because their bellies are white.
Oh, okay.
So they are black. They are white horses with black stripes.
Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, because I'm thinking about, like, I had an Appaloosa, which is a Native American breed, and they are mostly white skinned, but they also have little black splotches in their coat pattern. So they have weird dappling on their skin. So that's why I was thinking that way. So I'm like, oh, well, my Appaloosa has white hair, but it's all just in particular areas. So yeah, I didn't know that. Thank you.
At any of your sites, do you find any early humans?
So we nowhere in the park actually find human ancestors. Well, we don't find anything because we don't have rocks from those periods of time. We do have a lot of Native American history in the park, but that's about as far back as any kind of human history goes in the park, as far as we know. Now, saying that, we do have a fossil primate, which is very, very, very distantly related to us. I mean, it's like, it's a primate, right? It's a monkey of some kind. And that is the most closely related thing that we find. And that's about a 29 million year old critter that looked more like a lemur than anything else. So that is probably the closest thing that we have to a human ancestor found in the park. And that's called Egamuashashua, which you find out in South Dakota and Nebraska, which is based on Lakota Sioux. And then our species out here has the species name of Zincanella, which is named after a Bureau of Land Management paleontologist, John Zincanella. So it is quite a mouthful to say that name, but we do have, and I'm sure that if we were still looking at the closed captioning on my PowerPoint, that it would have had no idea what I just said.
Yeah, some of the closed captioning was getting pretty amusing. It had no clue what Mesohippus was.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, last question to wrap this up. Looks like the last one that we haven't really gotten to is, how many horse fossils have you found?
Have I found, oh goodness. Probably hundreds. I mean, I spent a long time working in Nebraska doing highway paleontology work, and man, I think one of my favorite ones from that was a little fetal horse that I found. So a little itty bitty, probably like just, just out of the womb died horse. So there's like that cool one from like 12 million years ago. But I found dozens of teeth, hundreds of teeth throughout my career. And out here, I have found lots and lots of teeth. A friend of mine that works up in the state of Washington, we were at a site, and he and his crew had been working for a week, hadn't found a single horse at a site that was known for having horses. I'm on site for 3 minutes, and I find 2 horse teeth, right? So I'm kind of a horse tooth whisperer in certain sites. So I do find a lot of them, but it does tend to be individual teeth. And of course, the one time there was a fossil skull in my life, one of my advisors found it, not me, but I helped her collect it. So that was kind of cool. But yeah, so I would say like on the order of magnitude of hundreds. But I lost count after probably the first 50.
Can I jump in quick with a question?
Sure.
Okay, Nick, very specific question for you. How many 1.5 foot long plant roots have you excavated?
1.5 foot long. Oh goodness. I feel like there's maybe only one. And I completely forgot about it until now. But yeah, no, there was one down in Badlands. That was a pretty cool one. One of my employees actually here got really excited about a root trace because it was something we don't very often find out here, and so he collected it. But it was not 1.5 foot long. It was maybe like 1 foot long, and it came out in a boulder, so it was nice and packable.
All right, sorry, I had to
No
be crazy
worries.
for a moment. So.
Okay, looks like we've worked our way through the questions. We just had one last question that popped up on as far as, do horses lose their teeth like reptiles do?
No, they don't. So reptiles lose their teeth kind of in a way that is more similar to like if you think of sharks. So they go through more of a there's more of a replacement process there, and they have multiples that will come in and fill in those spots. But mammals, in fact, all actually, I don't remember exactly which one it is. I think, but definitely all mammals share this characteristic where they only have 2 sets of teeth. They have baby teeth and they have adult teeth. And horse teeth, they're just really long, really tall, and they last for a long time. But that's one way that animals deal with it. And this is actually a really cool place to bring up this thing called hypsilodonty. So rabbits have this thing where their teeth don't ever form a root. And so they continually grow throughout the animal's life. And that's really common in rodents. So yeah, that's actually a really cool thing, is that some animals just have really short teeth, mammals, and you have baby teeth, you have adult teeth, and then you're done. Others have slightly taller teeth. Others get stupidly tall teeth like you see with horses. And then you get rabbits, which are lagomorphs, and then you have all the other rodents, and they just go crazy with never letting their teeth stop growing. In fact, sometimes you'll see rodents that have their incisors that have what's called maloccluded, or not been meeting correctly with the lower tooth, and they don't trim it up properly, and they grow and actually have grown into the back of the animal's skull because they just keep growing and growing and growing and growing and growing until it eventually kills the animal for multiple reasons, not necessarily just that it's getting penetrated into the brain with a tooth, but it also makes it really hard to eat. They starve. And that's what we see a lot with domesticated horses too, is that oftentimes what kills a lot of them is just not getting enough food because, you know, they don't have teeth left. And we even see that with fossil horses. There are individuals that just have no more tooth, and then that's it. And then they're not long for this world because they just can't get the nutrients they need.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for spending the morning chatting with us. It was definitely an interesting topic.
Yeah, not a problem.
Branching off into the realm of mammals.
Yeah, so much fun. Mammals are pretty cool. People
Yes,
don't give them enough credit. Yeah.
Tomorrow, we have a guest speaker who's actually going to be chatting with us from Berlin. Her name is Yara Haridi, and she's going to be talking to us about bone pathologies, paleopathologies, so injuries that have been recorded in the fossil record. So that'll be, it's kind of one of my favorite things to look at is we had lots and lots of bone bed material of Edmontosaurus. And yeah, the pretty bones are fine, but it was like the gnarly ones that were really cool with weird knobs and breaks and lesions and all kinds of fun stuff. So I'm very excited about tomorrow too. So we've got mammals and all kinds of pain and suffering tomorrow, I guess. So thank you again for chatting with us and visiting. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And unless anybody wants to chime in, we'll just say thank you and goodbye.